Hello, everyone. This is the Revolutionary Think Tank podcast. If this is your first time here, this is a podcast about political commentary, protest music, and revolutionary thinking. My name is 4AS, and this is my co-host, Mr. E. So, Mr. E, how are you going today?
I am very well, 4IS. How are you, sir?
Yeah, I'm going pretty good. And
Glad to hear it.
with the topics you've been covering recently, I
Yeah.
thought I I thought it was probably a good idea to do the CFMEU, as
Mm,
well as I kind of wanted to throw another thing that it's not so as relevant as the CFMEU protests, as well as I guess them throwing out their administration. Oh, sorry, putting
yeah.
them into administration, and well, yeah, I guess they also threw out their current administration.
Yeah.
But I also wanted to cover the anti-protest laws because, look, over the last couple of years, a lot of interesting things have been happening political wise in terms of attacking worker institutions. And
Mm,
look, you obviously have a bone to pick. You've heard me before. I have a bone to pick. So
yeah.
why don't we
Yeah.
just cover it?
Yeah, let's go for it. And I think there's been a bit of interest in this one. Like, in terms of the CFMEU, just to bring people up to speed, that is the Construction, Forestry, Maritime Employees Union. Okay, so it's one of the largest, unions in the country, I would say, 4AS.
Hmm.
And very, very influential, massive donors to the Labor Party in Australia. Obviously, the Labor Party has links to the workers' movement at large and the union movement, so there's no real surprises there. But I'm just saying that to highlight kind of the significance of this union. And construction is like one of the pillars of the Australian economy. And as the
Yes.
largest construction union, they do control significant swathes of very significant and important work sites, construction sites around the country.
It's funny because I kind of feel like with, I guess, more progressive minds as well as more conservative minds, they both use the word militant to kind of focus on the CFMEU, but like
Yeah.
to also talk to their own bases. Like what I imagine is like, have you seen that Tobey Maguire Spider-Man meme where it's like. Uh, Hey, I saw the CFMEU protests, and I'm with solidarity with them. And then it's the Harry one where it's like, yeah, but Peter, don't you know how militant the CFMEU is, and like how much they hold things against their employers? And then the last panel where it's like, look, I said I support the CFMEU. You don't have to sell it to me. Like it's one of those things where it's like
Yeah, yeah.
militant. If you say that word to a leftist, they're going to be like, yeah, the union is
Yeah.
doing its job,
And
whereas the
yeah,
conservative is like, no,
yeah. And not even
but
conservative, just like the brainwashed, I don't know, average media consumer in this country slash the world is very put off by the word militant. It makes it sound like there's some terrorist organization. And like the word militant, it's funny that you bring this up because I just had this conversation with someone today,
oh yeah,
actually. Yeah,
okay,
yeah. And I was just like, oh, the word militant is dropped so many times in relation to the CFMEU. And it's very hard to understand what it is they're talking about exactly, because the way they use the word is like this dog whistle kind of to
mm,
like to anyone who's kind of a little bit scared of what a union might do, which is for the general public is usually, they might shut down certain parts of the economy, and I'm going to be partially or like very inconvenienced somehow, but which is usually a very minor way. But like, yeah, so like the
I'm
word militant is just like this
yeah,
propaganda dog
yeah.
whistle kind of term that like, I don't know, just gets reactions out of viewers and
Mm.
listeners and stuff like that. It means nothing though. to these people. Sorry, what were we going to say?
All I was gonna, we'll wind this back later, but I'm very glad you brought up the note of being inconvenienced, because that very much ties into the anti-protest laws. But like, keep on
Right,
continuing.
right,
We're gonna
yes.
come back to that. Like,
We will get there because
yeah,
it's pertinent to both of these conversations. But yeah,
mm,
the word militant has been used, like, dropped so many times by like media organizations and particular personalities, and like they don't actually say what is militant. Now, like, there might be some type of implication there that their tactics are militant because they are rather forceful in the way that like their members act towards other workers on site, other unions. But like, I think what they're trying to say is just because they're so active and they get like they're so organized
mm,
in the way that they strategically take on the employers or the business sector and government in this country,
yeah,
that makes them militant. Like, if that is what makes them militant, like what you said before, for AS, that is their job. That is
yes,
the only reason they exist, in
yeah,
order to represent their members and put pressure on the status quo, the
mm,
establishment, to get more stuff for their members. And if
yeah,
that's what makes them militant, by doing what it is that unions do, like, people just have absolutely no connection to reality and no understanding of history. Like, militant back in the day, in terms of like industrial revolution style times,
yeah,
was illegal activity. So, like, doing strikes that were, banned by the government and made
mm,
like an illegal form of political expression, sabotaging workplaces, like throwing a spanner in the works, like if you were working
mm,
at a factory, like destroying machinery, like going nuts and like going after your, I don't know, your boss or the capitalist owner, like going after their
yeah.
house and trying to burn it down. That was what used to be considered militant. Like,
I,
not
I, I'm
not
so.
do
Yeah, yeah. Like, I'm so glad you brought up Spanner in the Works. Like, a lot of people think about that, where it's like, oh, it's just a saying, but no. Like, Spanner in the Works, and the history behind that was, the workers, if they weren't paid properly, they would literally trash the factories, because
yeah,
it's like, do give in to our demands, or we will screw up your capital.
yeah,
Like,
we will literally screw up the means of production.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, and what are you going to do then? No workers, you have to fix your means of production. You're definitely going to be out of pocket for a long
yeah,
time. This is going to affect your profit margins.
yeah.
That's militant.
Mm,
That is militant. What the CFMEU are doing by like being angry at and responding or reacting to this
mm,
this government crackdown is what people do in a democratic society or a liberal society, one
mm.
that respects people's freedoms and like human rights. Now, let's just explain, I guess, then, for the people that maybe not across this for AS, what's happened. So the
Yeah.
CFMEU, the construction arm of the CFMEU, thanks to some wonderful investigative journalism done by Channel 9 and 60 Minutes about 2 months ago, 3 months ago, maybe, there was
So,
some,
yeah.
avid claims, allegations. Let's just use the right terminology here. About them being basically the CFMEU, the construction branch anyway, being associated with organized crime groups, and displaying or being involved in corrupt behavior. Now, remind me to get back to that word corrupt, because I think it's being used wrong. But like, let's just say they're undertaking nefarious practices or frowned upon practices. So
Mm,
organized crime and bad business tactics have been uncovered again, like I said, thanks to some amazing and completely objective and unbiased journalism by Channel 9 and 60 Minutes, and that has just unleashed kind of a Pandora's box of like all of these people coming out of the woodwork, trying to make claims and further investigate, these alleged organized crime links, et cetera, and bad practices in the CFMEU.
I would
And
call
that,
it I would call it a moral panic, but again, we'll come back to
yeah,
that with the anti-protest laws. So keep
yeah,
going.
yeah, yeah. So then, yeah, like after about like what 2 months of that simmering, not even like a month or something,
Mm,
like the federal government decided that it had to do something about this. Now, like I said before, this is still at this point where these are allegations. Like, don't get me wrong, some of the evidence that was used in these investigations, like it's pretty obvious, it's video footage, unless it's altered somehow or taken extremely out of context, which is not outside of the media playbook by any
mm,
stretch of the imagination. Let's be honest here. However, it's pretty damning footage, but no court trial procedure, no legal proceedings of any sort, only trial by media at this point. And the government, and this is my problem with like things like Labour parties around the world
mm,
for IS. Don't get me wrong, it's not just exclusive to this country, but like you can get involved in parliamentary politics all you want as a Labour party. A Labour party supposedly being a party of the working class. But like at the end of the day, if you become a serious bourgeois parliamentary unit, your
mm,
job is not to represent working class interests, it is to get elected. That is the main thing here. And with the scrutiny that Labor gets in the media compared to any other political party, it would have been absolute political suicide to not have taken a stance against these allegations made against the CFMEU.
mm.
Like they would never have lived this down. If they went to the next election, everyone would have been like, oh, they didn't do anything about the CFMEU. And so by extension, they are as implicated as the CFMEU is in terms of being associated with bikies and organized crime. So Labor, the federal government had to do something. And so they rushed in some pretty haphazard legislation to put the CFMEU under administration.
Yeah.
Now, as I am no Labour Union historian, but I am pretty sure
Mm,
that this is completely unprecedented in this nation's history. We have had situations where unions have been deregistered, so
yeah.
they've lost their ability to practice as a union, but
Yeah.
like never has anything been put under administration. So what this legislation did was put them under administration, effectively sacking about like
Mm.
300. No, maybe that's more.
Yeah.
Maybe that's too many. Maybe let's say at least 170 or something like that, if not more than that, of the top officials in the CFMEU construction branch,
Mm,
and effectively put the organization or that branch of the organization under administration. So a
yeah.
government appointed administrator
Yeah.
comes in and assumes the functions of all of those top officials and guides the party for the next
Mm,
the union for the
yeah.
next 3 to 5 years.
And let me add a little bit of tidbit of information. So we've obviously gone into the past about how at least the left faction that I'm a part of with the Labour Party, um, when we were putting forth the uh, at least not the bills, but at least the motions about public housing and also stopping the selling of public housing that happened back in 2022, which we tried really hard and we managed to get it to the floor and get it across, which it ended up being state policy where the caucus agreed that they weren't going to sell any public housing and they were going to improve the stock of public housing. Guess who was supporting us all the way? The CFMEU, and specifically Rita Malia, who was one of the officials that was sacked.
Wow.
I, I, I,
Yeah.
I like. Don't get me wrong. Like, I don't have a personal dealing with her, but the person that was the head of putting all this legislation together, David and Zach, that I had dealings with within the party, they had close ties with her, and
Mm.
I knew who she was, and like when she did the massive speech that you went to, you probably didn't know who she was. She was one of the speakers.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I saw afterwards, I'm like, oh shit, it's Rita. But
Mm.
tidbit, I actually knew who some of the leaders were. So
Yeah. Yeah.
and
Well,
and
like,
these were people that backed us with the public housing stuff. So like
yeah.
at least the
Yeah,
left
so it
wing of the
flies in the face of that whole militant, like these are all just
yeah
a bunch of bikies that are all militant, um, hustlers and standover men that just go out there and harass people. Like they're out there advocating for essential public policy,
yeah
like public housing. Like we are in the middle of a housing crisis and you have a union out there advocating for public housing. Like they're obviously doing things for working people,
yeah
so like, it's the media narrative around this one is just immense, and
mm,
public opinion is just so so diametrically opposed to the idea of having unions in this country. It's just incredible, and this is from decades of propaganda and misinformation. I'm going to use a
mm,
current term there, that comes out from people that are just anti-unions,
yeah
and like it's just been ingrained in the Australian psyche that like unions bad, and like the union movement in this country is responsible for the fact that we are not living in a third world country right now. Like the Australian standards and you know yeah life living standards in this country are so high because of our strong union movement. There's no other way to say it.
yeah, but like I would take that dog whistle that you were mentioning before. I would take it one step further and say union equals organize equals bad. So like the fact that the CFMEU was so militant and so organized, it has to be bad. Like it's that sort of talking point that despite these unions being at the forefront and made sure that you work 8 hours a day, you work for 40 hours a week rather than I don't know 120 in
Hmm.
uh, Marx's time. I'm
Yeah, yeah,
probably
yeah.
like uh, look, I'm being facetious, but like these are important institutions and
But like massive for like the Australian way of life. That's what
yeah
I'm trying to paint the picture of here for
yeah
IS, is
yeah
that the union movement was so instrumental in the Australian way of life. It has produced living standards in this country that are the envy of not just like the developing world, but like the advanced world as well. Like we have good conditions here. We have good pay and a well-structured society, and much of that has come off the backs of the labor movement
mm,
and the union movement, especially, who have been there the whole time, been like, all right, if you're going to profit in this country, you're going to do business in this country, well, then working people get some too.
yeah
So, like, this is what we want. And they're always there, a thorn in the side. And hence why I'm saying there's just such a beat up and propaganda built up around the union movement. As soon as people say, oh, someone's going on strike or someone's protesting about
mm,
something, it's just like, oh, these militant unions, they're out there, they're going to be, clashing with police, or they're going to be, a public
mm,
nuisance, and like they're all a bunch of grubs and all this type of
yeah yeah
stuff.
yeah
And like that is the sentiment. Like, I've done a lot of content now about this, short form, long form, whatever form, and like half of the comments I get is just like, oh well, they're all militant and they're all organized, we're in bed with organized crime, and they're all thugs and like all this type of stuff. And it's like very much like most of the comments I have to write back to, and I'm just like, is that you, Channel 9? Or like, do you work for 60 Minutes? Like, they're regurgitating exactly what they have been told by the
mm,
media. Don't get me wrong. And I just want to preface, or like, just put out this here as a disclaimer. Like, I am not saying that
mm,
the CFMEU has not done anything untoward. I am not saying that they don't have links to organized crime somewhere within the organization, whether it be at the top or like maybe the middle rung or at the bottom or riddled throughout. But like, what we should be doing is allowing an appropriate process to take place in order to establish that. And we shouldn't be tearing away the rights of people, working people, to organize themselves in a democratic organization.
Mm.
We shouldn't be just tearing that away on a whim or based on allegations. It's a dangerous precedent. And like, if people really cared so much about organized crime, then they would be going after the entire construction industry and putting the entire construction industry under administration until everyone can be sure there's no dirty bikies in there ruining up the place for everyone and putting up the cost of works for, and our cost of living crisis, etc., etc.
Well, yeah, but that's the whole point of the expose, wasn't it? It wasn't just the unions that were corrupt. It was it was the construction industry that was corrupt.
Yeah, it's really funny. Like, if you go back to the original 60 Minutes hit piece that started this all off, they have these experts that come in, right? Like former police commissioners and people that headed up the last Royal Commission that happened into the union, specifically into the CFMEU. And like, they're like, oh, so like the CFMEU are corrupt, right? They're full of organized crime. And like, they try to push these experts and stuff. And the experts are like, well, yes, it's the entire construction industry that needs to be cleaned up. And they're just like, yeah, but the CFMEU, huh? They're bad, huh? And they're just like, yes, the entire construction industry needs to have a shakeup, like, kind of thing. And like,
yeah.
And it's clear as day that the problem is the fact that the construction industry is riddled with this type of stuff. But here we are, dragging a union through the mud, and the only repercussion so far of an entire industry that is subject to the problems that people hate so much about the CFMEU is a union has been put under administration. Lo and behold, a story as old as the Industrial Revolution itself is playing out right before us here in the 21st century. Like, I am just like shocked and appalled as someone who has studied Marx and revolution as extensively as we have for AS, that this is still happening today. Like, I'm just like, I just shocked. I'm in awe. I don't know how to explain how random this all is for us.
Well, actually, I'm genuinely curious because obviously you've done your videos and your shorts and all of that have said, what this actually means in terms of opening the door of like, yeah, okay, so a Labour government or at least a more progressive government might put the CFMEU under administration, but then what happens when the coalition get in? Like they'll just use that as a reason to kind of ram that through to all of the unions, and even if they don't do it, there's always going to be the risk that they might do it. But I'm curious. Has there been an update with any of the CFMEU stuff from what you've heard?
Not from like a couple of weeks ago, since I last kind of looked into it and went along to the most recent round of protests that they had. But basically, the sentiment that was coming out of the CFMEU anyway at this protest, which was like, this is extremely dangerous as a precedent. It's an attack on them and their members directly. They think it is, if we had one, they'd probably say something like it's unconstitutional, but like, we don't have anything like that. So they're just saying it's government overreach at its absolute finest and scariest. One of the speakers went as far as to describe it as fascism, which I thought was pretty incredible. Like, if you look at the history of fascism, it started, like, its sole purpose in the beginning in both Italy and in Germany was to crush workers' movement and specifically rid the workers' movement of communists. But like, don't get me wrong. The first thing that like that fascists did when they actually came to power was basically make unions illegal.
Mm.
And so, like, by extension, this type of draconian legislation that was quickly passed through Parliament or both houses is very, very inhibitive and authoritarian on a very strong union in this country. So, like, this person wasn't too far off the mark. I don't know if they said it out of passion or if they are actually backing it up with, their historical understanding of fascism, or they were just
Right.
using, a very emotive word to describe the situation. But like, they're not too far off by describing it like that. And so, like, I guess the thing to talk about in terms of like what really played out with this legislation in terms of an update, because like the media will never tell you this, and like
Mm.
I don't know why the Labor Party doesn't make this more available for people to be across, but like maybe they need to be a little bit more subtle with this type of news because they don't want to piss off maybe people in the construction industry. But the original time when they first put this legislation through, which
Yeah.
I think is fascinating, it makes a lot more sense. Like I said before, it was political suicide for them. It would have been political suicide for them to not touch this one and let the CFMEU kind of go.
Mm.
Now, what they tried to do was they tried to rush through the legislation to put them under administration. However, from what I understand, in that original proposed bill, there was clauses in there or some type of provision in there to allow anyone in the construction industry
Yeah.
who also was found to be acting in a corrupt way or acting in a way that is, I don't know, associated with organized crime could also be put under administration. And
Mm.
so that would have left it open basically to doing what I was talking about before, which was like a whole scale potential shakeup of the construction industry, not just unions. And guess what happened? It went through the lower house. It went through the House of Reps, but it was stopped in the Senate by the Greens.
Mm.
They didn't want to touch it. And like you've seen Greens people get up and they're even turning up to CFMEU rallies and talking about this type of stuff that I've been saying, that this is an attack on democracy and human rights and all that sort of stuff. But they refused a bill that
Mm.
would have enabled an actual investigation into the construction industry. So they knocked it back because the Liberals were never going to support that. So the coalition was never going to get on board with that. So it was only the Greens that could have helped that bill. They knocked it back. So Labor had to cut that part out. They sent it back to the upper house. The Greens knocked it back again. And Liberal were like, yeah, we'll take that. And so they passed it. And so
Mm.
we got the watered down version of what could have been something that would have actually tackled this. Instead, what we got is just a union witch hunt bill. And
Yeah.
like you were saying before, this is a dangerous precedent.
Yeah.
Let's just say we have a change of government at the next election. And if this is the standard now, that a union can be brought under administration, so taken over by the government,
Mm.
based on allegations, not any actual findings in a proper legal process. Could you imagine what could happen next time? Like a bunch of, I don't know, nurses at a hospital or teachers go on strike for better pay, and like somebody in the media says, oh, these teachers were out there and they set a car on fire and they damaged public buildings, and they'll be like, that's it, put all the teachers under administration. Like, it could be that flimsy.
Mm.
An allegation could be made, and if it's disrupting the economy, like kind of thing, a Liberal government, why wouldn't they act on allegations and just start shutting down unions or putting them under administration whenever they feel like it?
Mm.
Why not? The door's open now. The precedent has
Yeah.
been set for us.
Yeah, and well, look, it's not like we haven't been grappling with these sort of things before, because this might be a good segue for me to talk about the anti-protest laws.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, scary stuff.
so back in 2022, uh, the then in New South Wales, the then coalition government, they decided to ram through in our legislative assembly and our kind of state governments anti-protest laws. So to kind of give people at least an understanding of how the laws work before these were rammed through, is if you had, or at least were trying to organize a protest, what you would have to do is you would go to the local LGA, police station, and you'd be like, "Hey, these are the details of what the protest is, etc., and what prima facie, or at least in the first instance, what happened is everything is golden, and it was on the police to prove whether there was a reason or there was a reasonable person's test as to this protest is dangerous, or it's going to be obstructing X, Y, and Z, blah blah blah, and then they had to go to the courts to prove why this protest shouldn't take place. So it was a courtesy check-in via the I guess the protest leaders, and then it was on the police in order to prove otherwise. Now, the anti-protest laws, they kind of flip things on the other way. So the protesters, or the people that were organizing a protest, had to go to the police, and then the police determine whether whether it's something that is dangerous or whatnot, and if they do establish a reason, they can just say, "No, you're not having this protest," and then it's on the organizers to then go to the courts and be like, "Hey, what I don't see why you shouldn't allow this, and these are my reasons X, Y, Z." And so, if, for example, you wanted to protest something on climate, or I don't know, another reason, uh, the way the new laws happen, these anti-protest laws, maybe something that would be relatively reasonable to anyone that wanted to go to that protest. Maybe the organizers, if they have to go that extra step, mightn't want to follow through and go to the courts and do
They might
legal
not be able to,
proceedings.
yeah.
Well, maybe they don't even have the means in order to do that,
Yeah.
and suddenly you can't hold that protest because the police said no.
Yeah.
So this brings us to the Violet Coco situation. Now, you probably remember around about that time, there was those protesters that were on the Harbour Bridge that kind of blocked off a lane, and they stood there with flares and stuff like that, protesting the climate catastrophe, etc., etc. Now, Violet Coco was caught up in all of that. I think she was one of the protesters, and uh, a massive moral panic happened around that because a lot of people were pissed off about the inconvenience of the situation. They weren't able to get to work because these protesters blocked a lane. And, I heard that kind of argument again and again through the media, and people kind of spouting it. And at the time, my thing, my kind of pushback to people was because, I actually had a lady that I know of that was kind of talking in those points, and I kind of said to her, I was like, "Well, you have a right to work. You don't necessarily have a right to conveniently go to work."
Yeah.
And the whole point of protest is, you kind of are inconveniencing people and you're trying to get people's attention.
Yes.
By
Yes.
all means, there can be a question as to those sort of tactics, whether they are getting people more on side or more offside. But that is a completely different discussion. Like, the point of a protest is to rally people to the cause, one, but also make people aware of the cause, two.
Yes.
And the Violet Coco situation, what happened with that is she got, and I think like a bunch of other people as well, they got 15 months in prison for this situation.
Hmm.
But they actually, they went to the courts and they went on appeal on it, because what they actually ended up finding was the reports that the police issued is there was this report that apparently, in the act of parking their truck on the harbour bridge and blocking that lane, they had actually blocked a ambulance that was trying to get to an emergency situation. And you're obstructing a state institution doing what it's want, and doing what it needs to do, and therefore, this is a massive outrage, and you shouldn't have done that. Again, talking about the inconvenience stuff, and that was a huge reason why, in the original proceedings of the case, is why she got the 15 months along with the anti-protest laws, which, if I remember correctly, it was you can get up to $220,000 fine, as well as up to 2 years in jail.
Yeah.
And she ended up getting 15 months. So they disputed that on appeal, and what they actually found was eyewitness. I don't know whether I think it was eyewitness reports, and there were various other um, uh, uh, evidence to prove that the police had actually produced a false report, and there was no ambulance at all.
Hmm.
And apparently that all was completely fabricated. And the
Yeah.
only thing is that they had lit some flares and they'd obviously obstructed the lane,
That had inconvenienced people. Yeah.
inconvenience people. And the district court judge was kind of a bit like, oh well, hey, I've kind of got to throw this out because you kind of made stuff up. And
Yeah. Yeah.
what ended up happening, and what the reframing after it was, is okay, this is the first court case based on the anti-protest laws, and they've immediately been thrown out of court.
Yeah.
And I think she ended up getting some community service and other things, because resisting police and all that business. But all of the parts that were based on the anti-protest laws, those sections were completely thrown out. And
Yeah. Yeah.
she was obviously like, oh, this is great for democracy that this didn't establish a precedent with the anti-protest laws, and this proves that they don't, they're unconstitutional.
Yeah. Yeah.
And like yeah, and it was something that the coalition put through, Labour backed, and like I can tell you right now, much like the CFMEU, a lot of the inner city and like left faction people are not impressed with Labour at all, with the situation with the CFMEU, let alone the anti-protest laws.
Yeah. Yeah.
And really, all it's doing is attacking worker institutions, as well as workers' rights, uh, just for a bunch of employers.
And that's how it seems for us. That's exactly how it seems. And so, like with the protest law stuff, like you raised a number of points, and like I wanted to interject a number of times, but I couldn't because I wanted to see how the story unfolded. But like, look, I think you raised some good points in terms of protest is exactly about, as you described, I would say actually primarily about drawing people's attention to something. And sometimes you don't know about an issue until you see it broadcast in the news because somebody's done a stunt or protested in some way. So one, it's about awareness, and then two, it's about causing some level of disruption to orderly public life in order to make a statement.
Mm.
Like that, it's in the name. It's a protest. Like it's right there. Like it's pretty obvious. And so, like, if people are minding it, like, if people are inconvenienced by that, well, like, tough tits. That is what happens when you live in a liberal society. Like, political expression, free speech, all of these dear liberal values that we hold very close to our hearts are really important for a functioning political landscape. You don't just get to turn off things because they are inconvenient. The same people the same people that complain about protests and people going on strike and that type of stuff being inconvenient because they can't go to work or they can't drop their kids off at school or like they just don't want to hear about it in the news. Those same people that are all for crushing protests and strikes and all that sort of stuff are the same people that complain about wokeism and say that's an attack on my rights and my freedoms, and I should be able to say what I want and do what I want, and without having to look over my shoulder and worried about being cancelled or like called out and all this sort of stuff. You can't have it both ways. Okay, if something is inconvenient for you and you don't want to hear it, then turn and look the other way. Turn off the TV if it's upsetting you that all of the media outlets are just running this thing nonstop because hate and fear fuels people's interest in media headlines and stories. Turn off your TV, put your phone down, throw the newspaper out the window for anyone who still reads newspapers. If it really upsets you that much, you have a choice. You can ignore it. But like that doesn't mean that if you are inconvenienced and you are angered by this, that you get to encroach on other people's rights to express themselves politically. Let me just say this, and I will say it again because I've said it multiple times. I don't mind being repetitive because apparently that's what you need to do to get messages across. But the right to protest peacefully, I'll put it in brackets, fine. The right to protest and the right to strike or at least form a union, they are human rights listed by the UN in its articles that were drafted by a series of free and liberal nations after World War II. If they thought it was okay then, after going through the greatest war that mankind has ever known, such devastation brought upon and rained upon the entire planet, and they thought then to put these things in as inalienable human rights, who are you sitting at home to say that these people shouldn't be doing that? Who are you as a government to legislate things that curbs people's abilities to undertake their human rights? It's an absolute attack on people's rights and freedoms. That's it. There's no interpretation there. You can't say it nicely. You can't say it any other way. That's what it is. If, as you've described it, these protest laws were put in place to allow the government, through the police, to obstruct people's right to protest, people just want to do the right thing. If they have to fill out a bit of paperwork, I think that's a stretch. They shouldn't have to fill out paperwork at all. There's public property out there. You can gather on public property without a permit. That is why we have public property. Fine. You had to fill out some paperwork, and it's the police originally who had to prove that you shouldn't be there for some reason because it was unsafe. That's their job. It is not your job as someone who wants to protest and express themselves politically to demonstrate that you should be there in the first place. If you are a citizen in this country, if you are in this country anyway, legally, you should be able to gather in a public place whatever reason that you want to do. And protesting is, as I've said, a human right. So obstructing the process by layering it up with red tape and legislation is draconian craziness. Just like putting the CFMEU under administration. These things are attacks on our standards in a liberal society, and we should be very scared about the way things are going, not just in this country, but across the liberalized world. These are authoritarian measures. They are authoritarianism. There is no other way to describe this. If it's the opposite of liberalism, it is authoritarian. If you're reducing people's freedoms and their rights, it is authoritative.
Yes.
And like cracking down on these things, which are forms of political expression. I'm not just talking about people going to the park to kick the ball around. Like, these things are forms of political expression.
Yes.
That type of stuff is the stuff that keeps a democracy healthy. When people are able to challenge the status quo and shake things up a bit and get people talking about stuff they wouldn't have known about otherwise.
See, I'm kind of really glad you kind of brought that up, because obviously there's a recent example of that, right? The Melbourne protests outside the Melbourne Convention Centre.
Yeah,
Like,
with the Land
yeah,
Forces 2024, the
yeah,
expo.
yeah.
Yeah.
Which you covered again, is that if they didn't do that, then I wouldn't have.
I wouldn't have known.
I
I wouldn't
wouldn't
have
have
known.
known. I wouldn't have known that there was a bunch of arms dealers and arms dealers at the Melbourne Convention Centre thinking about the latest weaponry and how to kill people.
Yeah,
Like,
basically. Yeah, how to rain death upon children across the third world, let's be honest. So basically the heads of the military-industrial complex of the world were meeting in Melbourne, and lo and behold, at this expo, guess who can't go? Members of the public. You have to basically be like an arms dealer or a high government official to be able to get into this Merchants of Death convention.
well, you basically have to be Tony Stark at the beginning of the movie
Basically.
when he's a complete arsehole.
Yeah, that's
yeah.
the type of people that are congregating here. And these protesters rocked up to make it uncomfortable for them to walk from the car park to the convention center. And so the police were ordered in like a private militia to stop these protesters, making it uncomfortable for these merchants of death to get into the convention center. That's all it was. They threw some red paint at people, made it pretty obvious that they were merchants of death, and they were like congregating in public places, which again made it uncomfortable for these people. And so the police were called in to move them along. Now, if you listen to the story in the media, it was, these people were violent from the get-go, and so they had to be dealt with. They weren't violent until the police used force to move them out of public places. These were all students. Let's be honest here. They're just young people expressing themselves politically. This was not a terrorist organization or an alt-right or hard-right group that has sworn to rain death down on illegal migrants or something like that. These people were actually fighting people or demonstrating against people who actually trade in death.
Yeah.
These people actually build their lives around killing other people, and they were protesting that, and they were the violent ones. They were the violent ones for IS.
Well, it's the massive conservative playbook, right? Accuse your opposition of doing the thing that you're doing.
And here we are. And we question why our societies and like politics and all this sort of stuff is going down the drain, or it's never been this polarized, etc., etc. It's because like we've completely lost all of our standards. They're gone, and they're going quite fast too. It's scary times for us.
Yes, but despite how depressing the conversation has been, MysterE, I feel like it's been a good one. And
It's been enlightening, yes.
Yes. And of course, the last segment, as it always is, what's that synthwave art? Yeah, for this one, it was
Anti-protests.
Yeah,
police or
so
something?
so
Like,
yeah, the police cracking down on workers' institutions.
yeah, right. Wow. Well, they've definitely got the police in there.
Yeah,
Eh?
I think it's a POV actually.
Yeah, right. Okay. Yeah, interesting.
Maybe a picket line and the police are coming.
Yeah, 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 yeah. I don't know what to say. Like, it'd be more damning if the AI had put it on a lower angle to look like you were already on the floor or something. But at least at this point, you've got some balance there. You're meeting them eye to eye, the establishment, before it rains down necessary force on you. Eh?
And with that, remember everyone to like, share, and subscribe. And remember to keep thinking and keep learning. And I'll give it off to Mr. E to sign us off.
Thank you very much, 4AS, and to all of you out there. Yes, to reiterate, if you liked this episode, give it a like, leave a comment, subscribe for more. And thank you. Don't forget, I am, you are, we are a mystery.